once again to the Classics Capsule with me, Sean McKiernan, and this time we are looking at one of the real classics of its kind, with a briefer look at the sequels which unfortunately followed the initial masterpiece. The film in question was made in 1960 and is The Magnificent Seven. Now, the film had a very complicated and very difficult development phase. It's an adaptation of a Japanese film called The Seven Samurai. And it began its life as The Magnificent Seven when Yul Brynner came up with the idea of doing an Old West remake of The Seven Samurai and an Old West version of it. And with this idea, Yul Brynner went along and approached Walter Mirisch of the Mirisch Corporation. He explained the idea to him, and Mirisch absolutely loved the idea, and then went along to Toho Studios to negotiate the rights for the Seven Samurai so that they would be able to make the film. Once he got the rights issue sorted out, he then went to United Artists and sorted out a distribution deal for this new version. And then the problems began when Anthony Quinn immediately hit Yul Brynner with a lawsuit and sued him for breach of contract, because Anthony Quinn claimed that he had actually worked out all of the details for this film with Yul Brynner several years before, and now Yul Brynner was trying to take all of the credit for it. It took a fair amount of time for it to be settled, and in the end it came down to the fact there was absolutely nothing in writing at all in this supposed agreement between Anthony Quinn and Yul Brynner, and the whole thing was thrown out, which then gave the Mirisch Corporation the green light to go ahead with the film. The film was then allocated a producer who also directed it, an absolute genius filmmaker named John Sturges, who then went along and started getting the thing written. And here again, the writing of the film was another absolute minefield of controversy and issues. An associate producer for the film named Lou Mohlheim commissioned Walter Bernstein, who was actually blacklisted at the time, to write the first draft of the film. And Walter Bernstein basically took the script for The Seven Samurai and just wrote exactly the same film and exactly the same story, but just set it as a cowboy film. Not that many people liked this particular version of it, which isn't really surprising, because like, rather than Japanese characters, they were just characters from the Old West, and that's basically was the only difference. So as a result of that, Mirisch himself brought on Walter Newman, who rewrote the first draft of the thing, and he wrote what was very largely what eventually appeared on screen. The only problem that then arose was that when the principal photography then started, Walter Newman wasn't available to actually be with the film. He was busy on other projects by that point. So another writer named William Roberts was brought on board to handle any rewrites that were required on a day-to-day basis while the film was being made. Everything, as far as that side of the thing, went very smoothly until William Roberts then went through the Writers Guild of America to insist that he was given a writer's credit on screen, when in actual fact he only wrote something like about 4 or 5 lines of dialogue just to compensate for what was actually there on the actual location. And when Walter Newman found out about this, he insisted that his name was taken off the credits. So, as you can see, the film had a very difficult birth and development the whole way through, and it didn't really improve when it actually went into production. In terms of casting the Seven, Yul Brynner, as the instigator of the whole thing, was pretty much automatically cast as the leader of the Magnificent Seven, Chris Adams, who was a Cajun gunslinger. But in terms of the rest of the Seven, as Vin Tanner, John Sturges pretty much from the very beginning wanted Steve McQueen. The two had worked together on a film in 1959 named Never So Few. But the major problem, the major stumbling block with this was that Steve McQueen at the time was under contract to a television series named Wanted Dead or Alive. McQueen wanted to appear in The Magnificent Seven, but he couldn't get the time away that was required from his television series. So in conversation with his agent suggested to Steve McQueen that he should stage a car accident. Now bear in mind, Steve McQueen was a very experienced racing car driver. He was a very, very good driver of a vehicle, but Steve McQueen heeded his agent's advice and went away and staged a car accident, and then told the television company that he had whiplash and had to wear a neck brace for 8 weeks, so was unable to make Wanted Dead or Alive. He was promptly given time off from Wanted Dead or Alive to recuperate from this alleged car accident, and he promptly went to Mexico to film The Magnificent Seven instead. The thing some people will do to get a paycheck, but never mind. Charles Bronson was cast as O'Reilly, who's a professional gunslinger down on his luck, needs money, and who's Mexican and Irish, and casting Charles Bronson in a role like that, yes, gunslinger, very, very successful in sort of playing very, very rough and very tough characters. Robert Vaughn was cast as Lee, who was the traumatised veteran, very much haunted by his past and by people who he'd killed in his past. Brad Dexter, the fortune seeker named Harry Luck, such an appropriate name for a fortune seeker. Hurst Buchholz as Chico, the young hothead who in the film has tried to impress Chris Adams numerous occasions, and Chris has never been interested, but allows him to join the Seven. And the last one being Britt, the gun and knife expert, and there was actually a bit of trouble in casting this, in that nobody actually initially wanted the part. Sturges initially offered it to Sterling Hayden, who turned it down flat, and he then went to John Ireland, who also turned it down flat. However, there was a stroke of luck in Robert Vaughn, who'd already been cast, who had a friend from drama school days named James Coburn. And when Sturges met James Coburn and outlined the film to him, it turns out that James Coburn was actually a huge fan of The Seven Samurai, and at that point had watched the films 15 times. And when it was explained to him that this film is basically a remake, for want of a better word, of The Seven Samurai, James Coburn agreed to do it on the spot. So Sturges then has his cast. Everything's absolutely wonderful. They started then going into the actual production and the filming schedule, and the original script was given to the cast, and Steve McQueen was not a happy man, because originally he had 7 lines of dialogue, and at this point he wasn't exactly what you call the massive name he subsequently became, but he was certainly well known enough to have more than 7 lines, and he wasn't particularly impressed by this. And by way of a diplomatic solution to it, Sturges basically said to him, "I will give the camera to you. So anytime it's on screen, the camera will be on you." Steve McQueen then did everything he possibly could to get in shot. And this caused a huge amount of tension with Yul Brynner, who, as the instigator of the whole thing and the main star of the film, thought that the camera should be on him all the time and absolutely nobody else. Steve McQueen then started an incredibly petty campaign while the film was being made, such as whenever Yul Brynner has a speech, Steve McQueen would stand behind him rattling shotgun shells. He would pull his hat down over his eyes to make him look more dramatic when he was on screen with Brynner. Or he would stand behind Brynner and flip a coin. For no apparent reason, he'd just do it, just to make sure the camera focused on him rather than what Yul Brynner was doing. When Yul Brynner realised what Steve McQueen was doing, he decided to take matters into his own hands, but rather than speak to Sturgis or the producers or anybody else. Despite the fact that he was actually half an inch taller than Steve McQueen, he decided he wanted to appear even taller than that on screen. So anytime Brynner and Steve McQueen were on screen together, Yul Brynner would build up a mound of earth and stand on the mound of earth so that he looked like he was several inches taller than Steve McQueen. And when Steve McQueen realised what was happening, he would quite happily kick the dirt from under Yul Brynner's feet while the shot was being taken. You can't keep things like that quiet, and the newspapers found out what was going on. The newspapers started to report that this new film was beset with tensions between two of the leads. Yul Brynner was instructed to issue a statement where he stated, "I don't feud with actors, I only feud with film studios." But when you watch the film, it's quite clear that the two of them are not getting on very well. As and when there is a new member of the Seven recruited, you will see Steve McQueen standing there counting the number that they've got on his fingers. Yul Brynner has such a vicious look on his face for most of the film. He's either an absolutely incredible actor able to channel this anger that his character is feeling towards the bandits who are raiding the Mexican town that they are there to defend, or he is feeling genuine animosity towards one of his co-stars and basically can't wait for the film production to end. As the villain, the lead Mexican bandit, we have Eli Wallach. A wonderful performance, wonderfully underplayed. And it's actually quite a shame at the end when his character is shot and killed by Chris Adams. And his last line when he's lying on the ground dying and he says, "Why are you defending these people? Why?" And he doesn't get an answer. Chris Adams can't answer him. It's not the traditional happy ending with the Western, in that the Seven throughout the film do not see the final reel. The final shootout, we see the death of Charles Bronson's character, Brad Dexter's character, and James Coburn's character, and also the most heroic of all, Robert Vaughan's character, who suddenly manages to find the courage to go charging forward, save some people from being shot, and ends up being shot himself. The film finishes on an incredibly downbeat note when the three survivors of the Seven, as they're riding out, they go past the graves of the four comrades who have fallen. And Chico comes out with the line of, "What did we do it for? The farmers can't understand it." And Chris Adams just looks at the graves and says, "Only the farmers won. We lost. We will always lose." And the three survivors then disappear over the sunset, and the film ends on an incredibly downbeat note. It was scored by Elmer Bernstein, an absolutely fantastic, one of the most recognisable theme for any film ever is in The Magnificent Seven, and the theme actually, it's so good and so recognisable, it does cause the rest of the score throughout the film to be overlooked. But the whole thing, the orchestrations, everything are just so powerful and so moving and so stirring. It really does set the scene right the way through the film. And it is an absolute genuine, I suppose you can say modern day classic, even though it's from 1960. It was remade in 2016 with an entirely new cast, including Denzel Washington, and the remake's not a patch on the original. It's nowhere near as good as it. Now, the film did very, very well at the box office, and it did very well critically as well. The critics absolutely loved the thing, and it was a substantial hit in the box office, which unfortunately, of course, Hollywood being Hollywood, means that they have got to make a sequel to it. Why is anybody's guess, but it was decided, yes, we will do another Magnificent Seven, which is a little bit silly when 4 of them were killed. It took 6 years for the next one to come out, which was called, not exactly imaginatively, The Return of the Magnificent Seven, in which Yul Brynner returns again as Chris Adams. But even though the characters of Vintana and Chico are also there, perhaps unsurprisingly, Steve McQueen does not appear. A little more surprisingly, maybe, as the horse Buchholz wasn't included. Julian Matthews replaced Steve McQueen. Sorry, Julian Matthews replaced Horst Buchholz, and Robert Fuller replaced Steve McQueen. It's set in exactly the same village and is basically a rerun of the Magnificent Seven, where the village is being raided by bandits again. And so Chris Adams goes off and recruits another 4 members to form another Magnificent Seven. And perhaps not surprisingly, again, 3 of them, or 4 of them, are killed during the final shootout. The Return of the Magnificent Seven was directed by Burt Kennedy, and it was universally panned by the critics, and it didn't do anywhere near as well as the original in the box office. Maybe not surprisingly. The new 7 didn't really have the charisma, didn't really have the personalities, the performances aren't really as good. Yul Brynner, for his part, he tries, but it looks like his heart isn't really in being back there. And the whole thing is actually quite a sorry episode, but it actually gets even worse, because in 1969 we then get the Guns of the Magnificent Seven. And this is really the most bizarre thing of the lot, when you get Chris Adams again coming back for the Guns of the Magnificent Seven, but Yul Brynner was not interested in returning to this thing. So, fortunately for Paul Wenkos, who directed the Guns of the Magnificent Seven, there was an actor named George Kennedy, who just had a massive success co-starring in Cool Hand Luke. The fact that he bears absolutely no resemblance whatsoever to Yul Brynner is completely immaterial. He was cast as Chris. And again, there's a whole new 7 put together. And if you sit and watch the Guns of the Magnificent Seven, you sit there and just wonder why. Why did they do it? Like, why are they carrying on doing this thing when the first film was a perfect standalone film? There was no real follow-on to it. There was no way it could be carried on, but they just carry on and carry on and carry on. They still didn't learn the lesson, Hollywood, and in 1972 we get the Magnificent Seven Ride. By this point, the age of the spaghetti western had arrived. We had films coming along of the same sort of era, such as The Good, the Bad and the Ugly. And I suppose in a way it's logical that you've had a massive hit in a western in the Magnificent Seven, so let's do a spaghetti western version of the Magnificent Seven. Chris Adams is again used. He's now a marshal, and this time he's played by Lee Van Cleef, who, at least in some ways, bears a bit of a resemblance to Yul Brynner in that he's got incredibly menacing eyes in much the same way that Brynner had. He bears absolutely no resemblance to George Kennedy. They're completely different builds, for one thing. Kennedy was quite a powerful, stockily built man, whereas Lee Van Cleef was very, very slender. George McCowan directs, and out of the three sequels, The Magnificent Seven Ride is probably the best of the three of them, but it's still not a patch on the original, and it was again universally panned by the critics, and it was a monumental flop in the box office. The loss it made was absolutely astronomical, so quite wisely the films with The Magnificent Seven ended. It wasn't, however, the end of the story for The Magnificent Seven by a long way. In 1998 there was a television series of The Magnificent Seven produced, which as a regular co-star had Robert Vaughn from the original Magnificent Seven playing a judge who would, at the start of every episode, hire the Magnificent Seven to defend a village, usually which had one of his relatives live in, a little bit like Murder, She Wrote, where if you were a relative of Jessica Fletcher, you could guarantee you were going to be accused of murder at some point during the course of it. The TV series ran for 2 years, being axed in 2000, and again, that as itself until 2016, when The Magnificent Seven was remade, was pretty much the end of the line, except television didn't know when to leave a good thing down, and television produced a thing called the A-Team. And the A-Team was originally conceived as a sort of mixture between the Dirty Dozen and the Magnificent Seven. So the original choice for the leader of the A-Team, Hannibal Smith, was, believe it or not, James Coburn. James Coburn was not interested in the thing, so George Peppard ended up being cast in it, who, by a huge coincidence, had appeared in a film called Battle Beyond the Stars, which some people will call it a homage. I prefer to call it an almighty rip-off of The Magnificent Seven. It is basically exactly the same story. It is exactly the same film, even down to casting Robert Vaughn in exactly the same character as a space-age coward who has done all kinds of things as a mercenary. He's now traumatised by what he's done, but at the end of the film he plucks up the courage to sacrifice himself for the good of a planet that they are defending, which is called Akira, which is a neat little tribute to the director of the Seven Samurai, the Japanese director Akira Kurosawa, who also was one of the 3 writers of the original script for the Seven Samurai as well. Battle Beyond the Stars was not actually the first time science fiction crossed with The Magnificent Seven. We have the BBC to thank for that, and a writer named Terry Nation, probably more famous science fiction wise up until this point as being the man who created the Daleks in Doctor Who in 1963. But in the mid-70s, Terry Nation wrote a new science fiction series for the BBC in which he basically directly lifted the name of the thing as well, Blake 7, which was originally conceived as being the Magnificent Seven in outer space. I suppose the advantage that the films of the Magnificent Seven have over Blake 7 is that for all of the films of the Magnificent Seven, the character of Chris Adams is there. So their leader is there, whereas Blake 7, of course, after 2 years, Blake disappears, but it was still called Blake 7 for some strange reason. Who are we to argue? We are merely the audience. The Magnificent Seven as a Western, as a parable, and with a very, very powerful message. It's probably one of the best films ever made, in all honesty. And it proves the old adage again as well, which seems to happen over and over again, that when a film has a troubled development and has problems when it's actually filming, the end result, somehow or other, seems to be an absolute classic. And that's the same right the way through, going right back to the old black and white days, like the Casablanca, films like that. Incredibly troubled production, absolutely fantastic film at the end of it. The Magnificent Seven, it's one of the films where when you watch it, everything seems to click perfectly into place. The cast is perfect, the locations are perfect, the performances are absolutely pitch perfect, which is incredible considering the two of the main stars basically didn't like one another. And the whole thing is tied together by the score, which just bubbles away underneath the surface, holding the whole thing together. If you're one of the people who's never seen The Magnificent Seven, you really should go and seek it out and give it a watch. If you're feeling in a bit of a kamikaze mood, then carry on and watch the 3 sequels. They're not as good. They are entertaining, in all fairness, they are entertaining. Just don't expect them to be as good as the original. There's very few instances where that is the case, and this is one of the ones that proves the original is the best, and they really should have stuck after the first one rather than have the cards dealt another 3 times. That brings this episode of the Classics Capsule to a close. This is Sean McKeon, and I hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll see you again next time.